The French were badly spread out just across there, and Pakenham's men were tucked in behind this ridge. Wellington rode up to Pakenham and gave some classically simple orders. Ned, do you see those fellows on that hill over there? Throw your division into column and drive them to the devil. I will, my lord, said Pakenham, if you will give me your hand. Wellington shook his brother-in-law's hand rather stiffly, but he was clearly very moved. Then he galloped off to give orders to his other senior commanders. The French were astonished by the appearance of Pakenham's division, beginning an attack which, it was to be said, beat 40,000 men in 40 minutes. The battle that followed was hard fought, but Wellington never doubted its outcome. He was all over the field that day, giving personal orders to his commanding officers, acting like the mainspring of the well-oiled clock his army had become. When he did stop, it was usually up here, with a clear view of the battlefield and the two Arapiles. Early in the afternoon, he saw his cavalry carry out a near-perfect charge down there, and called out to its commander with unusual excitement, "By God, Cotton, I never saw anything so beautiful in my life. The day is yours." The day was certainly Wellington's. Marmont, up there on the Greater Arapile, was wounded by a shell early on, and although his successor bravely launched a counterattack, Wellington was ready for that too. By nightfall, the French army was in headlong retreat. An officer saw Wellington with the light of victory on his brow, but his voice was calm and gentle. Salamanca raised Wellington to prominence on the world stage. It was a truly great victory. 14,000 French casualties to 5,000 Allied. Wellington and his conquering army made a triumphal entry into Madrid on the 12th of August 1812. The French fled when they heard of Wellington's approach. The Allies were feted on every side. Master of the Spanish capital, Wellington shared in the festivities, and the honours poured in. The British raised him to Marquis, and the Spanish made him Generalissimo of the Spanish armies. An extraordinary accolade for a foreigner. Francisco Goya made this sketch of Wellington from life in Madrid. Despite the fact that it's a moment of triumph, there's a haunted look in Wellington's eyes. It's quite unlike any other picture of him. During the sitting, Goya saw Wellington explode at his chief medical officer for disobeying an order, even though it improved the situation. "Who is in command of the army? As long as you live, sir, never do so again. Never do anything without my orders." It was a mantra constantly repeated to the officers around him. It must have been emotionally exhausting to be responsible for everything all of the time. Perhaps that's the tension that Goya saw in Wellington's eyes. After Salamanca, there was more hard fighting, with its inevitable ups and downs. But Wellington did finally achieve his goal and drive the French out of Spain. In October 1813, Wellington's troops crossed into France. As Captain William Bragg put it, "We had infringed upon the sacred territory at last." The final phase had begun. A week later, far away to the north, the army of Napoleon Bonaparte was decisively defeated by an alliance of European powers near Leipzig. Despite this dramatic development, Wellington pressed on and captured the city of Toulouse. The night Toulouse fell, Wellington hosted a grand dinner. During the meal, an official communication arrived confirming extraordinary news. Napoleon had abdicated. he was to be banished to the Mediterranean island of Elba. King Louis XVIII had been restored to the French throne. Wellington called for champagne and rose to toast the King of France. Next, the Spanish general Alava proposed the liberator of Spain. Wellington had won his war. And his Spanish victory had helped bring about Napoleon's overall defeat by draining French manpower. Britain seemed to be safe. Wellington was one of the saviors of Europe. By the time Wellington returned to England, he'd already been made a duke. To the British public, he was a national hero. The country was wild with celebration and adulation. People cheered his carriage all the way from Dover to London. When he reached Westminster Bridge, members of the crowd took the horses out of his carriage to pull him home themselves. But Wellington was too quick for them. He jumped on a horse and rode all the way to Mayfair, to a home that was in fact entirely new to him. Inside were his wife and 2 young sons. He had not seen them for 5 years. Now back in the same room, husband and wife were as far apart as ever. Picking up the threads of a family life that had never really knitted together was difficult for everyone. Outside, the nation stood in awe of him. The Speaker of the House of Commons thanked Wellington on behalf of the government.
When the will of heaven shall have swept away the present generation, you will have left your great name and example as an imperishable monument, serving to perpetuate the existence of this country among the ruling nations of the world.
But Wellington knew that he had achieved this status of conquering hero without ever being put to the ultimate test. He had never faced Napoleon himself on the battlefield. And Wellington was very glad of it.
I would at any time rather have heard that reinforcements of 40,000 men had joined the French army than that he had arrived to take command.
Universal peace now seemed assured. The European powers met in Vienna to decide how the continent should be divided. Wellington represented Britain. Early on the morning of the 7th of March 1815, the Congress received shocking news. Napoleon had escaped from the island of Elba. Day by day, the reports grew worse. The marshal sent to capture him had gone over to his old commander. Now Napoleon was marching through France, heading for Paris. The Tsar of Russia, who was with Wellington at Vienna, laid his hand on the Duke's shoulder and said, "It is for you to save the world again." So Wellington and Napoleon would meet in battle, after all. In next week's programme, Wellington meets Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo.